Hey guys, it's Khalil,
Hey, it's Chad.
and we are the Marshals of Truth. Okay, so starting our part three for this series we just started on Peace v. Freedom, one of our main series, just to make it clear, and hopefully we'll make it clear with maybe a renaming of our some of our videos or with playlists on our YouTube page. But our main series are different from some of our special series. We have the main series with why is truth important, and then the second main series being on far left equals far right, a warning. Then part three of this main series is what you see right here, the Peace v. Freedom. Now this one is going to be a long one, you know, and I don't want to quite spoil for you guys, but the second half will bring. And then the last one, as you probably have heard, as mentioned time and time, a bit of spoiling it a little bit, but not too much. We're going to be eventually bringing up the modern empire, with our final special series for our final main series of this saga. And then the special series, the first one being about the whether or not the nukes in Japan of 45 were justified. The next one being about nuclear deterrence, and then the next one after that being about wait, did we have another one?
Ethno-nationalism was the
Ah,
one after
yes,
that.
yes. Ethno-nationalism was the most recent special series. Now we are quite pressed for time in terms of recording because both of us, as you remember, we're both very young, and we're both going to be heading off over to college very soon, and so we won't have too much time to record. But we do have some really interesting series in backlog that we want to introduce to you at some later point, maybe only a few weeks after our Modern Empire series ends. But we do have some really interesting ideas, and I'll hype you guys up for that at some later point. But anyway, just to um, get you guys ready for that and to clarify all that with the series and saga and what we have planned and all that. Getting back over to the point of this particular episode, which is largely going to be on the progression of freedom in society. Um, there's a certain recognition that if you look if you look broad and wide throughout multiple countries, um, since um, um, since the beginning of historical record till today, and of course it's going to be hard to look at like the progression of freedom around the world because some nations developed faster than others, so we can only expand so far. So we're mainly going to be looking at, sorry to say it, but a Western lens. We're going to be looking mainly at Europe, the Americas, um, and North Africa, as well as some portions of the Middle East. Um, so the first example is going to be like slavery, and religious tolerance. And first, starting off as a very bad example of how those freedoms were not accepted. About how slavery was still in practice. The people were still enslaved. Like the exodus of the Jews from Egypt, in ancient Egyptian times, roughly around the reign of Ramses II, maybe Ramses III. I'm kind of missing on them
Yeah, I
exactly.
think it was the second.
Right, like roughly like 1200, 1250 BC around that time, as both described in Judeo-Christian religion. Um, and so then moving on into history, you have the development of the first democratic movements in Rome and in Athens. Both interestingly, while they both had their own flaws in their democracies, um, they excluding certain parts of very large parts of people out of the population that they were governed, um, there was still a democratic movement, in those areas at roughly the same time around 500 BC. And then, as time moved on, there were servile wars, in Rome, in ancient Rome, even before the Roman Empire existed, and even before Julius Caesar became a political force in Rome. there were three servile wars, one in 130 BC, the other one 100 BC, and the other in 70-ish BC with the famous story of Spartacus. All of them were thousands and sometimes tens of thousands of enslaved people in Roman territory, like banding up together and trying to become free. They were the first, one of the first freedom fighters. Um, and um, that's an example of the development of progression of freedom, just looking at the ancient examples. And I'll let Chad, because I've been talking for a while, go into the other. Actually, wait, I'll explain this one. The social reforms of Rome, because a lot of people don't know about history in general, but about some of the intricacies of ancient Rome. Rome was partially a democracy, partially a monarchy, partially an aristocracy. This was called a mixed government, as we'll explain later. But um, as Rome started to expand in ancient Rome and become more powerful in the Mediterranean region, in defeating most famously Hannibal, who was nearly on the brink of ending the Roman experiment. And after Rome eventually won over that opponent, Hannibal, representing the Carthaginian Empire in North Africa. Rome had a huge amount of territory in Mediterranean that it now controlled, far more than just the outer regions of Rome and just the Italian peninsula. So with the expansion of such territory, the aristocrats began to gain much more land, meaning that the lower class people that were for most of Rome's history, um, like also a lot of really poor people, because not everyone was an aristocrat fighting in these armies. They would not reap the benefits of their conquest. It would be the rich families of Rome that would buy thousands of acres of farmland, and then from the conquered peoples that would become slaves, they would work those slaves on that land and then sell it over to the state for a huge benefit. And the people, the poor lower class people that might have helped in the territorial expansion and fought in those wars did not reap those benefits. Now, the Gracchi brothers in around 100, 110 BC wanted to change this. They wanted to introduce some sort of land reform so that lower class people would have the ability to buy land. They would just limit the amount of land that these aristocrats would buy. But so much loopholes and so much political intrigue, and the aristocrat dominated Roman Senate, you know, they assassinated both the Gracchi brothers for even daring to speak up against the aristocracy in Rome. And then there's Caesar, around 40, 50 BC. He, as much of a dictator as he's crowned to be, he advocated for free food, for the poorest of Rome's citizens and for land for veterans, as well as other social reforms that would increase the quality of life of Romans. So that's some ancient examples right there of the progression of freedom.
Right. So to take a step back, what we see here is the progression of civilization and governments from groups of people, groups of, or a state or law, evolving from something that's only to secure peace and order towards systems that start to benefit the people, that start to give certain privileges to the people living under that government, and to give them things that, might make their life worthwhile. And so, just like with those recent examples Khalil gave of Caesar, in the government, he's giving out he's give as you said, we said like free food, land, all these kind of reforms that the government is giving back to the people. And so what you see is a difference from the overall just progression on how governments and civilizations were formed, in that it wasn't just it was changing, I'd say, changing from an order in which kings and queens would just rule over a land and make sure there weren't any fights with other governments or within their states, into a place where the government is starting to give back the citizens some sense of freedom or some sense of privileges or rights, as it will be defined later, to the people who live within these civilizations. And so you see this progression of the regaining of freedom within these societies, within, as I said, human civilization overall. And going from that, some more examples that you see with that is the abolition of serfdom. And this was a phenomenon that happened in um, Western, Central, Eastern Europe between kind of the years of it mainly started around 1100 AD and then continued all this process continued all the way to the mid 1800s to the abolition of serfdom in Russia in 1861. And so with that, you have the abolishment of a system in which people would be serving under, a noble would be assigned their land, and then the peasants would work for, the peasant serfs would work for those nobles, and those nobles would work for the king. You have the abolition of that. You have the idea that people can progress upwards in whatever class they were born into. It's not that it's not anymore that the order in which societies or civilizations were created would have to stay that way. You have the emerging phenomenon that people can move up from that. They don't just have to live their lives as a peasant working on the farm. They might be able to go to school, go to church, get a job in a higher position, maybe even work for the government or work in the government. And so you get this progression in which people can move up, and in their societies, it's not, the government there is not simply about just keeping an order. It's about giving back the freedom that humanity had way, way, way back then when we differentiated ourselves, of course, from the animals of the earth. Giving back pieces of that freedom in a cycle, in a progression that will continue throughout our history. As you can, you have another example you wanted. But there's more as we go along this progression, but there's one seems that we overlooked.
Right. I was talking about Rome, and I was talking about Athens for their democratic movements and the servile wars in Rome, as well as the social reforms of the Gracchi brothers, of the attempted reforms of the Gracchi brothers and Caesar's reforms. Um, but then also, I completely forgot about Alexander the Great. Now, in the topic of peace v. freedom, it's hard to look at him domestically as a great example of that. But in terms of just simply like social reforms and bringing forward like good benefits to the people that lived under him, he is also a great example. If you look at like historical records, and anyone that knows a significant amount about ancient Macedonia, which I'll admit aren't very many people, um, during his wars of conquest, for the tens of thousands of men that followed him to the far reaches of the known world at the time, all the way over to India, because that's what some people don't understand. This guy didn't just fight in Persia, he didn't just he didn't like there's a reason why he's called Alexander the Great, because he never lost a battle and he fought to within 3, 4,000 miles away from his home, never losing, constantly on the march. But anyway, when he was on this massive conquest, you know, um, like any soldiers that died that had families, to provide for, those soldiers did not have to um, they did not have to worry, in their dying breath over whether or not their families would be provided for, because Alexander, he would pay the families of said dead relative that fought in this war, against the Persians, enough money that they could live self-sufficiently, off of that payment for years, even before they could somehow get back on their feet. So this is a very generous thing that Alexander did. He also built statues of brave warriors back home, soldiers that fought particularly bravely, that Alexander and his generals pointed out. They could just simply be like a common soldier, like a 20-year-old that put forward a valiant effort in a particular battle. If they died in that battle, and was recognized as being a hero that saved the lives of many of his Macedonian fellow Macedonian soldiers, they would have a statue built for them courtesy of their king back home, and their family would be praised as relatives of a hero. And taxes, which is an additional feature of Alexander's reign, were abolished. The territorial expansion that he spread, throughout Persia and into the border with Pakistan and India, all those territorial expansions and all the loot that he got from the Persians meant that back home, you didn't have to pay taxes to the state.
Yeah. So as we kind of, again, what you have here is the evolution of a government that's giving back to its citizens, that's rewarding its citizens, like in this case um, for courage, for gallantry, for what they have done in battle, as well as just giving them other benefits that they have by living under this system that they established. And so it's part of the general progression of civilization in which governments aren't there to only just protect the order, protect the peace, but also to give some, like I said, privileges, some freedoms back to the citizens of the people who live under there. Um, and as we go along, as history, progresses, we have this continuation of the emergence or the reemergence, really, of the importance of freedom when it comes to the civilizations and the governments that create. And as I last talked about with the abolishment of serfdom, one thing that followed that was the rejection of absolutism, the rejection of kings in the European continent in the 1600s, 1700s. What we had was the overthrowing of the long-standing orders of kings who would rule over their lands, who would manage essentially everything, or appoint people to, or single-handedly appoint other people to do so. What we had was the destruction of that order by sometimes by the people, sometimes by the people of the state, sometimes through other means. But it was the reemergence of freedom within the people within those states. And so, I mean, in our last episode, we talked about the English Civil War and the execution of Charles the First, and that was another great example of how the order of an absolute king who was there only to make sure you keep the peace and manages the country for its citizens. That idea is um, excuse me, getting overthrown. It is getting removed from civilization. And so as this progression continues, we get more ideas of how the people, and um, not just a few godly appointed kings or nobles or popes or anything like that, not just those people are the people who rule over countries or states or civilizations. It could sometimes be the everyday man who can now be voted into a position, be appointed into a position. It's not just a king who gets to choose it, who runs the entire country, but so many more people are now able to participate in this way of governments. And this comes along with the emergence of liberalism, and again, we'll really dive deep into what that really means in some of our later episodes. But the emergence of liberalism, of the importance of the people in the freedoms that they have that the government needs to respect, as Rousseau and John Locke would come to describe in their social contracts, with the people realizing the freedoms and the rights that they hold, they would take to the government and make sure that government ensures that the rights are protected. And so as new ideas for ways countries are run and ways that more people are kind of participating in them, we have things such as free market, minimum wages, pensions, accumulating wealth, which is something new that people couldn't really do unless they were part of the aristocratic government. um, we had these new ideas that the government, or as well as the people of these countries, would have to debate over. They'd need to really figure out what they mean. How much should the government manage them? Should the government manage them at all? Should it just be left up to the people? Should we vote for everything? or should a couple people figure it out for us all, like the old kings of old did? And so around this time in the 16, 17, 1800s, there was a lot of philosophers who would debate these kind of questions and debate whether or not, debate really what government should be now that there wasn't the old order of kings and queens who would be doing everything. How would humanity create better civilizations that represented more people and could be done more efficiently? Um, and with that, we get to one of the philosophers that we're going to be keying onto in this episode and likely even the next. Um, and that is George. Is it George or I forgot how to pronounce his name.
Like Georg Hegel.
Georg Hegel, right. And he is a philosopher. We've also mentioned him in some of our previous series on the one about the far left and the far right, because he would eventually be mentioned by people such as Benito Mussolini. But Hegel was a prominent political philosopher of the time, and he had various different views on the implications of freedom that humans have, the implications of peace and order, and how a government should or shouldn't regulate that. With that, I'd like to start out with a quote from the book again that we've been referencing on politics by Alan Ryan. And in this quote, he kind of summarizes again the beliefs that Hegel had. Um, so to begin that quote, the mind, the embodiment of freedom, confronts the material world as something other or strange, foreign, and hostile. What of other human beings? They are physically part of the material environment that we have not yet mastered and made our own. Like any part of the external world, they limit our freedom of maneuver, but unlike any other part of the world, they pose a threat to our belief that the world is ours to use, enjoy, and control, because they are not only physical objects. They have a point of view of their own. They see the world as we do. Their view of the world threatens the view of the world that is the view of the world. The instinctive response of the unsophisticated self-consciousness imagined by Hegel is to think that if the world is theirs, it cannot be his. And so since this is it's a pretty loaded quote, and what it's doing is kind of outlining the point of view that Hegel would describe in some of his books, and it comes to describe what does freedom really entail. If everyone is free, and if the mind of everyone is free to interpret the world as they would, what happens when there's other people who don't share that same view? If your point of view is, if you see, say the wall behind me is blue, say that's what I observe. What if someone comes in and they say that the wall is green? What are you supposed to do about that? You see that there's a conflict in that freedom that, in this case, our minds, but just as humans have, that comes into conflict when not everyone comes to the same conclusion. And Hegel will go on to kind of describe more about that. But that's Hegel here again. He's describing the problems that freedom, which is something that, again, humans have had to deal with since the beginnings of civilization and the beginnings of man, is how do we deal with this problem of freedom? Do we just completely restrict it, or do we start to give it back to our governments, um, if they were to be ensuring peace?
Yeah, I mean, when I think about Hegel, we have more quotes of him, of Ryan's analysis of him, which are equally as interesting. Um, but when I think of him, I think about the matrix theory, the idea that, because everything is fake, we can do whatever we want. Now, of course, it's not the exact same thing. Hegel didn't say that the world isn't real. He actually said he said that because it was so real, you know, we shouldn't hold ourselves back from the over organization of a state. Um, the um, like the idea that when you're looking at Hegel, he tries to imagine a world that is completely free, as Chad is mentioning. But he really starts to imagine and think really what that means. And more of the quotes that we're going to read help to explain that the best, because people, they really think we will benefit from not having a state. They really think that by getting rid of the order and the peace that a government has, that they will somehow be free, and they will actually have more of a benefit from being free than they would by being under said government and living under such order. But Hegel, even if he legitimately believed that ultimate freedom was the best thing that any human could have, by reading his work and by being a little pessimistic from the beginning of what freedom entails, we can be a little bit we can we can begin to think exactly what it means to abolish a state. It would be reversing thousands of years of history and development that proved that we cannot have too much freedom. It's absolute chaos. Do you have any idea what that means? So moving into another quote, which helps our modern eyes imagine a little bit what full freedom means. From page 660 of On Politics, Ryan wrote, quote, based on the idea that each person, as an expression of their freedom, can do whatever they want, and the world is theirs, and everything in it, including other people, are theirs to control. Ryan um, no, oh, no. Ryan describes Hegel's view that he imagines, quote, a fight to the death between two competing wills. To display our superiority, we must show ourselves free from the encumbrance of the merely material world, and to show that we must be unafraid of death. The party to the struggle who is least afraid of death, who conquers his fear in extinction and ends victorious, is destined to be master. The one who sees in death the end of everything he values and would rather live a slave than die a hero becomes the slave. End quote. So that really is what ultimate freedom means. Like when people say like, oh, the abolishment of a state, that there's no order, you know, um, um, they don't know exactly what that means.
Yeah. And what you get in these last two quotes that we've read off is what absolute freedom really entails. Like when you imagine being completely free, yeah, it sounds nice. I could go everywhere I want. I could do anything I want. There's no government, no law, no order really trying to stop me or anything. That sounds great and dandy if you're the only person on the planet. But that's simply not the case. There are 8 billion other people on this planet who have different points of view, that have different beliefs than you. And so, if you in your absolute freedom wants to do something that competes with with someone else, you kind of you can't just kind of hope that it goes away. You have to compete with them. And what you had described in this last quote that we just read off, is that what that means is a competition that could come with even death and destruction, in which in order to make your free ideas, or your desires to be free, in order to make that real, you must conquer any other point of view that stands in your way. If that person who said that my wall behind me is green, and I want to make them sure that it is blue, I need to argue with them. And if that doesn't work, I have to show them or maybe fight with them. This idea of absolute freedom doesn't work when there's other people who disagree with you, because really, as Hegel would describe, the only way to make it that your point of view, if you believe it to be completely right, which to the knowing mind it kind of assumes so, if you want your point of view to be completely true, you have to dominate someone else's and ensure that yours is the only one that emerges victorious. So what you get here is just endless conflict. You're always fighting against someone else or other people who don't agree or don't kind of get the message that you're trying to get. Chaos. disorder, murder, fights. That's all you're gonna get. Because unless people just give up their point of views in which they've grown up and thought that they've understood the world as, you're gonna have to convince them. And usually that's not gonna be an easy thing.
Right. Because it's important to look back a little bit at the far left equals far right. That all right, that Mussolini called Hegel the philosopher of the state, um, and and that and there's a reason why he thought that, because Hegel, he was exploring these ideas, these extreme ideas of what exactly it means when you have ultimate freedom, that it really justified in Mussolini's mind when he was reading Hegel, that we cannot have too much freedom, because it really that there should be a certain amount of order and authority in society. That's why he said in his Doctrine of Fascism document that we referred to in that last main series, like, this will be a century of authority, this will be a century of the left, this will be a century of, whatever he said, a century of fascism, because he was just so scared of what Hegel was talking about. But I also think, we don't have much time, but the competition of wills that Hegel is referring to is proof that we need order. Not just because it's chaos, but because every person is trying to create that order by bringing everyone into the fold, about killing everyone else so that they could so that they could so that their view, that their way of looking at things is the only thing that holds out. The very idea that once we strip all order out of society, that everyone is going to fight each other, inside the mind of every single person that's fighting everyone else, they also want to create order. They want that order because they want their idea to be the only idea in the world by killing off everyone else. We secretly want order. We have tricked ourselves into thinking that we want chaos, that we want full freedom. What we really want is balance in a society best establishes that.
All right. So yeah, but we're in our next episode, we're basically just going to be continuing on with Hegel and explaining again the progression of freedom and how that's expanded on through societies. And then we'll get into our grander ideas of comparing complete peace and comparing complete freedom and what that really means and how that embodies itself in governments and other examples. And yeah, with that, we are the Marshals of Truth. We'll see you in the next episode.